Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. Another fantastic guest for you on the Sad Truth today. I've got Professor Philip Karl Zalzman. Uh, I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize. Professor of Anthropology at McGill University, and I'm mispronouncing it right after offline I had asked him how to pronounce it. That's how unfocused I am, but it'll get better, I promise you. Author of many books, including Post-Colonial Theory and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, an edited book, Culture and Conflict in the Middle East, Thinking Anthropologically, a Practical Guide for Students, Pastoralism, Equality, Hierarchy, and the State, Understanding Culture, and an Introduction to Anthropological Theory. And those are just the books since 2001. I didn't want to go further back because we'd spent the whole show just listing his books. Wonderful to have you with us, Philip. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. So we met because you were kind enough to reach out to me. I guess maybe one of our fans maybe one of my followers suggested that you contact me. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but you sent me an article that you had written in Middle East Forum. And as soon as I read this article, I knew that you were a man after my heart. And so I wanted to share a few quotes from that article, and then we could expand from there and talk about, the main gist. So this is an article that was written in, as I said, in Middle East Forum. So three quotes that I'd like to read out. My seminar students at McGill University told me that you can't say anything at this university without being accused of being sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, fascist, or racist, and then being threatened by punitive measures. They felt silenced by the oppressive atmosphere of political correctness. Nothing significant, sex, religion, relationships, public policy, race, immigration, or multiculturalism could be discussed. Only the acceptable opinions could be expressed without nasty repercussions. Then later you say, cultural and ethical relativism trumps even feminism. Great quote. And then there are no objective truths, but only many subjective truths. Postmodernists argue there can be no authoritative knowledge. So much stuff to cover. Why don't you, let's drill down each of these points. Get us going.
Let me just say that to begin with, that I'm in my 49th year of teaching at McGill. So I have a lot of experience at this institution and in this profession. And I always felt very at home in the university and in the university milieu. And over the last years, I found some very worrisome trends. And I've begun to see universities as a rather unfriendly place because of the intellectual and political trends. One of which is the problem of, for lack of a better term, political correctness. There's a sense that there's a certain set of truths, a certain set of correct behaviors that are not open to discussion, and that shouldn't be discussed, and that anybody who deviates from those should be punished. This is a violation of human rights. It's a violation of the right to your own conscience. It's a violation of free speech. It's a violation of the rights of free assembly, because if you assemble to talk about something politically incorrect, they're demonstrators and they break in and they block you and they attack you. This is a remarkable and kind of, it seems to me, goes against the entire spirit of what the university is supposed to be about.
Now here's the thing. You say this, and obviously to me, any sane person, whether they are inside or outside academia, should view what you just said as completely, lacking in any controversy. It should be, foundational to what a university is. So what is it that's causing our respective colleagues to not see that which you just said as such a self-evident truth?
Well, I think one of the things is that that the intellectual trends in the social sciences and the humanities have developed in a way that precludes openness to discussion. Here we come to the question of diversity of opinion. What I've seen is, when I first came to McGill, people had a lot of different views in the social sciences and humanities. There were a lot of different theories, a lot of debates, a lot of arguments. Now, everybody pretty much agrees on some version of Marxism or other. There are different labels for it: political ecology, political economy, post-colonial theory. I think if you looked through the social sciences and humanities, you'd find that the dominant theory today is post-colonial theory. And what does post-colonial theory assert? It says basically that all the problems in the world have been caused by Western colonialism, and that before Western colonialism, everything was lovely in the world. And consequently, the West is guilty of all the evil.
Everybody basically held hands and sang Kumbaya and listened to John Lennon Imagine until white man introduced this concept of warfare. But until then, there's absolutely no recorded evidence that there was any violence ever in human history, according to the Anthropologists of Peace, right?
One of the things that I think that's profoundly disturbing about the social sciences, about anthropology, sociology, political science, is that they have no historical knowledge, no depth of understanding. I've read that in the United States, for example, let me step back and say, one of the things you have to understand is that what's happening in the schools is a function of what's happening in the universities, because education departments are having even less substantive knowledge than the social sciences, are even more radical than the social sciences and humanities. And as a consequence, their teachers go out and teach in schools the most radical anti-Western, anti-Canadian, anti-American perspective. And there was a survey done of American students who said that slavery was a unique American problem and invented in America.
Right. That, for example, there's no historical evidence of Islamic-based slavery. That must have been a Zionist plot, right, to soil the name of the good Muslims, right?
Well, you're Islamophobic for mentioning it.
Right. So we've got all these sort of Marxist-based guys in anthropology departments, but it seems as though in anthropology, the ecosystem is sort of laden with faux intellectual movements. So not just the Marxists spewing their ideological based nonsense, but you've got but by the way, in terms of generative grammar, whenever I see the word post before anything, then that raises a flag that it's bullshit. So post equals bullshit. Postmodernism, post-colloquialism, post-structuralism. So maybe Chomsky could one day weigh in on why the introduction of post implies we are going to generate nonsense. But in any case, you've got radical feminists that sometimes will inhabit the anthropological ecosystem, the postmodernists. You've got, of course, the cultural relativists, which, of course, no one is probably better able to explain to us sort of the historical trend of that movement. So, but just kind of give people a background, Franz Boas is arguably the gentleman who sort of started this movement, whereby the idea is that really there are no, other than the most basic instinctual mechanisms, there are really no human universals that we can speak of. We are cultural beings, so whenever you want to study anything involving human affairs, you really have to look at each culture in its idiosyncratic milieu, and hence you have the rise of cultural relativism. And therefore, based on that original, very dogmatic and incorrect position, then we go out into the field always looking for ways to demonstrate that that which we thought might have been a human universal actually is not. So maybe you could first weigh in on cultural relativism, why it evolved, is it still as strong today as it was back in the days of Boas, and walk us through this whole lunacy.
Well, cultural relativism is anthropology's great gift to world culture. In fact, I think at an earlier stage, it was not quite as mad as it is today. Ruth Benedict in Patterns of Culture, she was a student of Franz Boas, and Patterns of Culture, a very popular book published, I think, in 37 or 38, argued that we should take a cultural relativist point of view in order to do research. And what she meant by that was you can't understand other people's lives by bringing your values in and assessing them. What you need to do is suspend your own judgment, go in and try and understand a culture from the point of view of the people who live in the culture. So it was really a research technique, and I think it's not invalid. Clifford Geertz later talked about research to understand the native's point of view. Native here, of course, can mean anybody anywhere, but whoever you're studying, people in Detroit, people in Toronto, people in Kyrgyzstan, you need to suspend your concerns and listen to their concerns. I think that makes a lot of sense, but it's been taken farther. It's gone from suspending your own values during research to an argument of ethical and moral relativism, that really, because cultures are different and each culture has its different values, you can't judge any culture because you're simply imposing your own cultural values. So in that sense, there's no way of judging between cultures, and consequently, you have to consider all cultures as equally good and equally valuable.
Except that white culture or Western culture is worse than the other cultures. So everybody is equal, except that some are less equal than others. Of course. Yes.
Of course.
So in the case of your original point about methodology, as a methodological guideline, it makes perfect sense. The problem is when it becomes a ideological mantra that then drives my worldview regarding everything, as you said, ethical and moral relativism, so that feminists become very confused, or at least Western feminists, when they are faced with sort of this victimology poker game where, if a man in a Western culture were to say something sexist to me, then it is perfectly fine for me to then, go after him and denigrate him and hope that he can lose his job, even if he made a passing joke that is completely inoffensive to anyone, because that's part of the patriarchy. On the other hand, female genital mutilation, child brides, honor killings, stoning of women, the subjugation of women, putting them in burqas. Well, that, you see, it's difficult for me to assess whether this is a good or bad thing, because who am I as a Western woman at Wesleyan? I don't really have the ethical tools to be able to weigh in on their practices. I mean, it's simply astonishing. It's difficult to imagine someone who navigates in the world with such a broken compass.
I couldn't agree more. I'm
All right,
stunned.
Good night, everybody. No, go on. Yeah.
I'm stunned by this kind of position. I see it, for example, if you look at Western progressive views of the Middle East, you have a kind of across the board condemnation of Israel a uniting of
Please
Islamists.
don't say Israel. Palestine. Palestine. Don't be
Oh,
Islam.
that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Palestine. It's El Quds. El Quds. It's not Jerusalem. Go ahead.
Right. Uh, and an alliance between leftists and Islamists, um, a very peculiar marriage. Uh, while next door, something approaching 1 million people have been killed. Uh, uh, women and girls are captured, gang raped, and sold into sex slavery. Um, Not to mention the normal things in Saudi Arabia and in Iran and so on. Um, there's such a double standard at work, which is not to say that Israel is not open to criticism, but somehow to use the most extreme form of criticism for one place and to totally ignore what's going on elsewhere is seems to me stunning. Uh, it just seems intellectually dishonest.
Do you think that it is a question of, I mean, at least that this is what I think, and then you tell me if I'm on the right track. In the same way that religion parasitizes the human mind in the following sense, that it forces the mind to reject reason. I mean, part of being religious is to jump into the pool of faith, right? And that's the
Yes,
mechanism. I think a lot of these ideological movements that are not religious based, I mean, ideological movements, I mean, postmodernism and radical feminism and cultural relativism, are forms of quasi religions in that while they use a different mind virus, they are also entering your brain and parasitizing it so that you lose your capacity to reason logically and you jump in a pool of faith. Now, it might not be a religious based pool of faith, but it's still something that is impervious to evidence, logic, or reason. Do you think that there is an analogy there to be made between religious mind viruses and some of the mind viruses that we're speaking of here?
interesting. I might use a different model. You know, one of my specialties is tribal society, and tribal society is based on two principles. It's based on a principle of uh, loyalty and devotion to my own kin group and opposition to other kin groups, so that the tribal system works when there's a kind of a balance between different kin groups. Uh, what I see here is, uh, you know, people have trouble holding a lot of different things in their heads. It's much simpler if you can have dichotomies of right and wrong, good and bad, my group and the other group. And what I see is that progressives, for example, have a set of ideas, and um, and reactionaries or fascists or whatever the alternative to progressive is, uh, they also have a set of ideas, albeit incorrect. Um, and the critical thing is you have to decide which group you're in. And once you're in that group, you accept the positions wholesale, and you can't start picking them apart because then you undermine your credentials.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually make the exact same point when people ask me, how do I label myself in terms of my political label? And I say, and here I don't mean to use a deconstructionist, I don't like labels. I genuinely mean I don't like labels because I tend to pick and choose my positions depending on hopefully some sense of cognitive consistency in my brain. So there are many issues on which I would be considered, say, take the American model, a Democrat, but there are many other positions that I would be considered a Republican. When it comes to social issues, I'm very, very liberal, about as liberal as can be. But when it comes to other issues, immigration, patriotism. I happen to believe in the death penalty for egregious cases. Then I suddenly become, a right-wing Nazi. And so I tend to, well, not I tend, I choose my positions based on hopefully a set of, cognitive arguments that I can make. And therefore I reject this idea. So if I'm going to use a label, I'd say I'm classically liberal, as I think you would also, in the classical sense of the term.
Yes, yes.
But of course, what we see, you're exactly right. And I see it amongst our colleagues, amongst otherwise very educated, sophisticated people. They're extraordinarily tribal in their thinking. And therefore, they could never enunciate a position that might make them perceived to be as part of, say, Republicans. And therefore, exactly as you said, if there are 73 positions, I have to agree with the Democrats on 73 positions. And no human could be so lacking in nuance, right? I mean, most of us will fluctuate, right? We go to the buffet of ideas and we sample different ideas. It can't make sense that out of 100 professors, we should agree on 100 different issues perfectly. And yet that's, for example, what I see on my Facebook page. Everyone other than myself agrees on everything.
There's so many different, each issue is so complex that you can spend your whole life going into any one of them. And we don't have time to do that. So we sign on to the party. And there are, going back to the American model, there are a lot of people who are independents.
Right.
They're not one or the other. But it's lonely to be an independent.
Right.
You don't have a structure. You don't have an identity. You don't have a badge.
Right.
And so it's a more anomic position to be in.
Except you can create a new tribe called, and actually yesterday I shared an article that came out where they listed the 4 top dissident professors. I like that term. The 4 top dissident professors. And yours truly is on that list. Myself, Jordan Peterson, I don't know if you know who he is,
Yes.
Janice Fiamengo, a 3rd Canadian at the University of Ottawa, and the 4th one was Camille Paglia, the famous feminist. And
Yes.
so, you know what? I consider us as part of a new group called Free Thinkers. And so if you need to have a badge, you belong to the club of free thinkers. So there you go. But I wanted to read a quote, since you mentioned tribalism. This is a quote that I originally cited in my book, The Consuming Instinct. It comes from Leon Uris in his book, The Hajj. It perfectly speaks to your tribal idea. So here's the quote. So before I was 9, I had learned the basic canon of Arab life. It was me against my brother, me and my brother against our father, my family against my cousins and the clan against the tribe, and the tribe against the world, and all of us against the infidel. Isn't that exactly what you talk about?
Absolutely right. Of course, that is an Arab saying.
Yeah, right, exactly. Exactly right.
And yes, they sum up their political position quite correctly. And what I argue in my book is that this Bedouin tribal precept is the foundation of Arab culture. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising because the Arabs originated in Saudi Arabia, and when Muhammad presented Islam, he was presenting it to Bedouin tribes. And when the Arabs conquered all of North Africa, Iran, India, and then across the sea to Iberia and so on, it was really Bedouin tribes who were the sharp end of the Islamic spear. You also have to take into account that this basic principle of alliance with my own group and opposition to others was incorporated into Islam, because Islam, in a sense, was another layer on top of Bedouin tribal structure. And so you get exactly that opposition between the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb, or the land of Islam, the land of peace, and the land of war. Muslims versus infidels. So you get exactly that kind of opposition. that's characteristic all the way down within the tribal structure.
Well, incidentally, I mean, that's when you talk, for example, about religion, you could look at religion as from an adaptive perspective. So some, for example, will argue that this is actually David Sloan Wilson who makes that argument, the famous evolutionary biologist, in his book Darwin's Cathedral. So he argues, look, from a group selectionist perspective, which itself is a controversial idea, groups that are religious, by their greater communal living, their greater cohesion, their greater likelihood to engage in cooperation and reciprocity, are going to outsurvive groups that are non-religious. And so that there you're arguing for the adaptive value of religion. But speaking to your point about sort of tribalism and how Islam makes use of that, another argument for religion from an evolutionary perspective is what's called the exaptation argument, right? That religion itself is not an adaptation. Rather, religion piggybacks, right? It exapts. It piggybacks on evolutionary mechanisms that are already in our brains for its service. And hence, coalitional thinking, which already evolved as part of our computational mechanisms in our brains, right? So we already are built to view the world as us versus them, members of my group versus all others. Well, then you have certainly Abrahamic religions that come along and usurp that computational system to their service. And so, of course, Islam does it very well, but even in Judaism, and believe me, I'm not arguing that all these religions are indifferent and they're equally good or bad, not at all. But certainly when it comes to the coalitional narrative, Judaism has, right, the Jews and the Goy. Christians have us who will believe in Jesus and will be redeemed, and all the rest of you who are going to hell. And of course, Muslims have the believers and the kuffar. So I think they're all successful narratives precisely because they feed the brain that which it already expects, right?
Good point.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Were you going to add something to that, or do you want to move on to the next topic?
I guess what I wanted to say was I wanted to go on from tribalism to the Middle East more generally.
Sure.
There's a tendency for people to look at the Middle East as different countries and as having different political parties. What I've argued and what I think is increasingly obvious, particularly in the Arab world, is that the tribal base continues to operate and results in a great many of these conflicts. That there is not a view in the tribal perspective of some overarching constitution of rules that apply to everybody. Tribalism is a form of particularism. And that means that you side with one group against others, and there are no universal rules that apply to everyone. My group, right or wrong, my group is always right. It's not even a question of whether my group could be wrong. It's my group. Once you've said my group, you've said everything. And so the constant conflicts in the Middle East, I would suggest, are a result of this. And the reason that all Arab countries are dictatorships is that Bedouin are very egalitarian minded and they don't accept a hierarchy. Taking orders from people leads you to lose your honor. And therefore, no one accepts as legitimate authority a political ruler. They're not legitimate. They can only maintain their position through coercion, through secret police and the army and so on. Thus, it's extremely difficult to build a consensual society on the basis of this of a tribal culture.
And I would add, I mean, you're mentioning that when you say my group, it says it all. My group must be right. I mean, that's a very dangerous mindset because there are no epistemological rules to sift through good versus bad ideas, right? Anything that is generated by my group is right. Anything that's generated by the other group is by definition wrong. And so, for example, I could say that if I were to meet a free thinker who happens to be of a Muslim background, but who believes in secularism and liberal values and modernity and science, I'm much more likely to have everything in common with him than I am with a Hasidic Orthodox Jew who walks around in Outremont, which is a neighborhood of Montreal, even though I happen to also to be Jewish, right? So the fact that I am Jewish and the Orthodox gentleman is Jewish does not guarantee that I will view him as a closer ally to me, epistemologically at least, than I would my Muslim friend. And so that to me is the way that you sift through people in deciding whether, if nothing else, you wish to associate with them. Do they share your worldview? And so by definition, I disagree with the idea that if you're Jewish, therefore you're my brother. No, if you share my ideals for reason, for liberty, for freedom, all of the things that caused me to run away from Lebanon and move to Canada, if you share in those values, then you are my closer ally than simply because you come from the same Jewish heritage as me, right?
You've lost your tribal credentials.
I am a heathen Jew. I am finished. I'm cooked. Apparently, a rabbi once told me that even if I were to disavow God, I could never lose my tribal belongingness, because once a Jew, always a Jew. Once you get in, you're done. So even I call myself an atheist Jew, I'm still a Jew. There you go. Let's go back, if we can, to anthropology, because I'd like to drill down a bit more on this tension between the biological-based anthropologists and the cultural-based ones. And I wanted to read a quote from a book chapter in the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology that was published. This was the first edition in 2005. This is Edward Hagen, who was trained, if memory serves me right, by John Tooby and Lida Cosmides, two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, one of whom is an anthropologist, but a Darwinian anthropologist. And so at the start of his chapter on controversies in evolutionary psychology, he quotes the following. So let me first give you the quote. "Boy, this shit ticks me off." This was apparently uttered by anthropologist Jonathan Marks, commenting on evolutionary psychology at the 99th annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association. And so you often have this visceral reaction, not only amongst the cultural anthropologists, but amongst social scientists in general, that this whole evolutionary theorizing, this whole biology thing is just nauseating. It's disgusting. It's deterministic. It is reductionist. Maybe you could walk us through those kinds of thinking within the anthropology ecosystem.
Well, let's go back to the point you made about Boas. You were absolutely right about his substantive theory. His substantive theory was that people's lives were a result not of their biology, but of their culture. He was a German Jew at a time when racial theories were very popular in Europe, and they really didn't appeal to him for obvious reasons. He wasn't on the good side of those racial theories. And so his first research was among the Inuit, and then he worked on the Northwest coast. And basically he came up with the idea that it's not nature, it's nurture that determines people's lives. And when Margaret Mead went out to Samoa, she went out with a mandate to study this question. And her book, Coming of Age in Samoa, is basically an argument that that the life of Samoan girls is different from those of American girls because the values and the structure of society are different. It's an interesting argument. There have been criticisms of it on empirical bases, but it was a very popular book, and it was a powerful attempt to demonstrate the power of nurture. and indeed the power of nurture over nature, in the sense that her argument was that in America you have puberty and you have adolescence. Well, in Samoa, of course, you have puberty, but there's no adolescence, because adolescence is a social and cultural phenomenon, not a biological phenomenon. She attributes this to the structure. She does a nice job in the book. There's been a lot of debate since, whatever the reservations about her empirical base, it's a good illustration of that point of view. So as cultural anthropology develops, it has a very strong anti-racist perspective, heavy emphasis on culture. So one reaction against evolutionary theory in anthropology, not so much evolutionary archaeology, but evolutionary biology, is that it's going back, it's feeding into a racist narrative. And that's something that it's not open to argument. It's clearly so wrong as to be worthy only of profanity.
But then you go ahead and build 100 years of theoretical and empirical edifice that is rooted in utter nonsense, right? I mean, their original position was laudable or noble in the sense that, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, look, all sorts of nefarious cretins misused biological-based thinking, whether it be the Nazis or whether it be social class elitists in Britain, whether it be eugenicists. So all of these people are misusing, quote, Darwinian theory for their nefarious political agendas and social agendas. And therefore, let's create a narrative of the human condition that will stop this from happening again. But in doing so, you might be violating, in the pure sense, the most fundamental reason that you exist as an academic, and that is the pursuit of truth. So, and on the one hand, you're trying to stop people from misusing the dangers of biological-based theories, but on the other hand, you're producing 100 years of bullshit. That can't be good either, right?
But they would reply now that there you go again, talking about truth with a capital T, and there's no such thing.
Right. My apologies. Yes.
There's been, since the 1980s, there's been a development that has been labeled postmodernism. And postmodernism basically rejects the idea of a scientific approach to society and culture and to human life. After all, it's science is a Western narrative.
Yes.
And it's open to all of these distortions, social Darwinism, and other negative things. And we know that you can't really judge other cultures because we have no independent base to make any judgments of that. Every culture has its own truth. Every person has their own truth. There's no way to judge between those. And so people who pretend that you can study these things scientifically and that they have some truth are charlatans. Not only charlatans, but likely racists.
Right. Yes. Of course. I've actually been accused at one point of being a Nazi because I'm an evolutionary behavioral scientist.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. And then I replied, I said, well, congratulations, you've identified a Jewish Nazi. And then the person was perplexed. Said, well, okay, you might not be a sort of a Nazi racist, but you must be sexist then, because you talk about all those sex differences. So by the sheer fact that I'm arguing that human beings in general, and in my case, consumers, because I study evolutionary psychology in the context of consumer behavior, by arguing that consumers are biological beings. Of course, they're also cultural beings. They're also shaped by socialization and culture. No one denies that. I was some ism. So if I wasn't a Nazism guy or a sexism guy, I must have been I was something bad, because no one in their right mind who has a pure heart could actually argue for this
Well,
biological.
exactly, exactly.
Right.
I'm going to commit a postism. We are in a post-evidentiary period, and so it's a matter of which, whether you're on the right side or the wrong side, whether you're with the good guys or the bad guys. There's a moral division, and evidence is not relevant.
But do you think, though, and obviously, as someone who's been in anthropology for, as you said, close to 50 years, do you feel, though, that all of these ideologies reached their zenith maybe in the 90s? And yeah, it takes a while for them to die out, right? As the old sort of quip that, paradigms die when the people who espouse them die out eventually, right? Do you feel that they're still going strong, or have we seen the worst of postmodernism, and it'll take a while to get rid of that nonsense, but eventually we're on the right path? What's your feel?
I haven't seen any happy change.
Uh-oh.
I see it all as picking up speed and kind of unifying the various parts. In fact, unifying now has a name: intersectionism, or intersectionalism, I guess, where we now agree that all of the good people in the world will agree on a certain side of every possible dispute, and will ally with all the victims in all of these different groups. And I think you're seeing that at the intellectual level too, that to be a respectable intellectual, you have to be a cultural relativist, and you have to be pro-Palestinian, and you have to, and et cetera, et cetera.
Islamist peace. Islamist peace. You have to say that.
Oh, that's right. Islam is right, and the Islamic State has nothing to do with Islam.
Yes.
That's right. Yes, Islam is peace.
And ISIS was created because of the cancer of Israel there, as has been explained to me, but by many of my enraged fans who otherwise think that for such a bright guy, I love the condescension and the patronizing, for such a bright scientist, it's too bad that I have such a blind spot when it comes to the whole ISIS versus Israel. I mean, every bien pensant knows that all of those dynamics in the Middle East are indirectly, somehow, vicariously caused by the existence of Israel, right? So, for example,
I thought they had actively set up the Islamic State.
Well, ISIS is Mossad agents. This is absolutely
That's right.
clear.
Yes,
and it makes perfect sense that, for example, the British Muslim guy who comes from an upper class family, who's lived in Britain his whole life, who studied computer engineering at a top university in England, decides one day to buy a ticket to Raqqa to throw off buildings, those dirty gays, and to kill those dog Shia. That, to me, clearly suggests that what caused him to do this must be the existence of Israel. I mean, what else could it be, right? I mean, it's really amazing, right? I mean, I satirize this all day. For anybody who follows me on social media, they know that I'm someone who uses satire and sarcasm like the surgeon uses his scalpel. But I do it because it's insanity, right? It's impossible for any normal person who has all of his cognitive faculties intact to actually concoct such nonsense. But I see it daily, not only now in my engagement with the public, but as somebody who grew up in Lebanon, somebody whose mother tongue is Arabic. I interact with these folks, and it always boils down to, in one form or another, I call it the evil juice. The evil juice is a term that I coined based on, I don't know if you know, there's a famous pancarte that a sort of an extremist Muslim guy was holding, where he said, "Death to all juice." He misspelled the word Jews, juice. And so I created this meme, which now I'm glad to see many people are using it. I never say Jews, it's the evil juice. And so, everything boils down to the evil juice. But this is not just some guy in Yemen. This is, as you said, your colleague in anthropology and his students. This is the white guy from Iowa who will write to me indignantly, not believing that I would fall for this idea that ISIS is Islamic when it is clear that it is the evil juice that is behind it. How do we inoculate people, or how do we bring them back to sanity? Is there a way, or are we doomed, Doctor? I guess your facial grimace says it all.
Look. All we can do is what we're doing.
Right.
And if nobody listens, it's the daste Khuda, as they say in Persia. It's the hand of God.
Right. You studied actually. Wasn't some of your field work amongst within that region?
Absolutely. Right. I lived among nomadic peoples, nomadic tribes in Baluchistan in southeastern Iran. And I lived there for 27 months. I got to know the people quite well. And one of the books that you didn't name is called Black Tents of Baluchistan. It's a detailed ethnography of the tribe that I studied in Baluchistan.
Did they know that you were Jewish?
They didn't. They thought I was Christian. And when I first got there, they were interested. And they said, well, I understand that you think that Jesus is the Son of God. And my answer was, well, I said, one book says one thing, another book says another thing. I said, what do I know? I said, are there different gods for different books? And they said, oh, no, there's only one God. I said, okay. And they said, okay. And that was the end of the discussion. It didn't come up again.
Which part of their culture, or which phenomena were you studying within that particular ecosystem?
Well, I was I'm a specialist in nomadic pastoralism, and I was interested in their ecology. I was interested in politics, in tribal politics, and in daily life. My ethnography is a classical one that describes most aspects of the society, the material culture, all the way up to religion and so on. And it's not a book that's well known in anthropology, but it's well known in Baluchistan. And Baluch have read it. And they're Baluch who live in Toronto, who live in Stockholm, and so on. They've read it, and they say it's right. It's dead on.
Are you familiar with Tariq Fatah? Do you know who that is?
Yes.
So I think he is a guy who weighs in often about the plight of the occupation in Balochistan, right? That people don't typically speak of, right? So the same people who will speak about, Israeli occupation are quick to forget that there are other patterns of so-called occupation. I say so-called because we can debate as to which parts of Israel are occupied or not. So you're familiar with some of his positions.
Yes, he's mainly talking about Pakistani Baluchistan.
Right.
But I made the same argument for Iranian Baluchistan. It's a different situation because Pakistan is a Sunni country, and so it's not a religious thing because the Baluch are Sunni. So that the occupation there isn't a religious thing. But in Iran, you have a triumphalist Shia government that kind of imposes its religious views as much as it can on Sunni Baluchistan. There's a lot of resentment over religion there, and there have been rebellions there. So you get a same kind of issue there. Look, all around Iran, there are people who feel they're occupied. They're the Turkmen in the northeast, the Kurds in the west. Baluchistan is but all through the Middle East, there military occupations of various kinds. Cyprus is an example, never gets mentioned, and so on.
But by the way, shouldn't we have started today's chat by admitting with great guilt that we are sitting on Iroquois and Algonquin land, and that just by virtue of that we are rapists of the land and so on? Shouldn't we have done that as bien-pensant people? You're just smiling. You don't want to say anything. Okay.
No, I do want to say something. What I want to say is that one of the trends I've seen in the university and maybe in society at large is an increasing emphasis on categories of people and increasingly a treatment of people according to the category they're in. You see it in university, colleagues being given raises because they're female, not because they're good. You see, although I have good colleagues, I've seen weak ones being given raises. We're now in the midst of engaging in racial hiring because my colleagues want to hire a First Nations professor as part of a project of decolonization.
Yes.
That's a quote from them.
Yeah, you got to decolonize your mind from all that science nonsense. There's actually a movement called Science Must Fail, which basically argues, there's a great clip, well, great and how tragic it is, a clip by some social justice warriors at University of Cape Town, whereby they were arguing that all of the stuff that you and I call science has really polluted our minds, and we have to hence decolonize our minds. And so the fact that McGill Anthropology Department is hiring the person in question is a manifestation of this decolonization process, right?
Well, that's the idea. To me, I mean, I find it offensive that people are dealt with according to their categories. I mean, it seems to me to go to it's not a way to get rid of racism. It's the reassertion of racism. It's going back to Nazi Germany, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it's basically taking the famous passage from Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech and doing the exact diametrically opposite thing, right? So I mean, literally, right? I mean, I have a dream that people will be judged by their character, blah blah blah, not their color of their skin. Well, the social justice warriors have doubled down well beyond just color of the skin, right? Now you've got to also be, we've got to have a certain number of people in the math departments who are trans, right? I mean, where is the number theorist at McGill who's not a trans person there, right? But what about, Lebanese Jews who are atheists and overweight, right? This is me. I see that there isn't enough representation of my type in pure mathematics department throughout the United States and Canada. And that makes me feel unsafe. It makes me feel disenfranchised and marginalized. And therefore, my future looks quite bleak, because unless I see another overweight Middle Easterner of Jewish descent in math departments, how am I supposed to go forward? Look, identity politics, right?
Absolutely.
Identity politics is a cancer of human dignity. But anyways, go ahead.
Look, it's exactly that. I mean, the classic liberal position is that people should be treated as individuals. But Martin Luther King, he's an old guy. He's been dead a long time. Just like that. What was that funny thing? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Oh, nobody pays attention to that anymore. That's old stuff. To me, you decide you're going to hire somebody from First Nations. That means, just like in the old days, a Jew can't apply.
Right.
But not only that, nor can somebody from China or Japan or India or Pakistan or Kazakhstan or Africa or any place else. So you're giving a privilege to somebody because they belong to a particular racial group, but there's an opportunity cost to that. It's a cost to all the other people who will not have that opportunity to apply. And it means, of course, that we get rid of the idea of universal criteria. We get rid of the idea of merit. We get rid of the idea of excellence, although I've been seeing articles about how, excellence, bad idea, bad concept. I haven't quite given it up yet.
Everybody deserves a participation trophy. Don't be sexist.
That's right.
There's actually a case. I'm just going to talk about this case, and then I'm going to ask you to give us any sort of latest stuff that you're working on as sort of the final send-off. There's a case, speaking of First Nation issues, at UBC. I recently discussed this case in a lecture that I gave at University of Ottawa on political correctness and the thought police and so on in academia. So this is a case, I don't know if it's been resolved, but at the time that I delivered the lecture, it was last winter, it was a case where I think it was a woman who was First Nation, a Canadian woman at UBC, who had gone up for tenure and I guess had been denied it. And then she filed a grievance with the Human Rights Commission. I don't know if it was at the federal level or at the provincial level. And they actually agreed to sit and hear the case. Now, I wish this were satire. It's not. She argued that in her cultural tradition, it's knowledge is transmitted. This would be interesting for you as an anthropologist. It's oral tradition, right? And therefore, by forcing me to communicate through this incongruent mode of communication to my culture, which is written, right? You actually have to write academic papers and write books. That was being racist against me. And they're actually listening to that case at the Human Rights Commission. So if I were sitting and trying to come up with hyperbolic satire that is as removed from something real, I couldn't come up with such a case, but that is the reality that we face today at UBC. That's all right. Tell us about any projects that you might be working on, any books that is not yet public that you'd like to perhaps promote here before we wrap it up.
Yes. One of the things I've started working on is the question of Canadian culture. Now, Canadian culture has been subject of debate. Some distinguished Quebecois politicians have said that Quebec has a culture, but the rest of Canada doesn't. English Canada doesn't have a culture. But it's interesting to hear our distinguished new Prime Minister also saying that there is no Canadian mainstream. There really isn't a Canadian culture. They're just I don't know. I guess they're just fans of Fidel Castro. I'm looking into this because I don't think that Canadians in general agree with that, and I'll tell you why. There was a big survey of Canada, of Canadian values, in which the respondents were asked, do you think that minorities should try harder to conform to the Canadian mainstream, or should minorities be encouraged to maintain their own traditions, practices, and cultures? And consistent with similar surveys, 68% said minorities should try harder to join the Canadian mainstream. Now, presumably, if you answer the question that way, you believe in a Canadian mainstream. You think there's something to conform to. And what exactly does that consist of is one of the things I'm looking into. But I can tell you that my students are always at odds with whatever the general Canadian public thinks.
Right. Well, because they are more sophisticated. They're university students, not like those Hicks in Alberta who work in the oil fields. Clearly.
And that's what they'll tell you.
Yeah.
That's what they'll tell you if you ask them, or why do you have these different views? Well, we're thoughtful, we're knowledgeable. I would say that they're indoctrinated rather than educated.
So is this going to be a book? Is this a book that you're working on, or is it an empirical work, or what is it exactly?
Well, the first article that you mentioned that was published by Middle East Forum was republished from Macdonald Laurier Institute in Ottawa, and this is a little task I'm doing with a mind to submitting it to Macdonald Laurier. We'll see where it goes.
Wonderful. Anything else? No?
I'm fighting in my university against all of these trends.
Keep up the good fight. Maybe I'll put in a good word for you so that you become one of the next inductees into the Dissident Professors Club. Maybe if that's something that you're interested in, come along.
I am a member of the Heterodox Academy.
Oh yeah, what a wonderful project. So am I. Yes, wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. I was actually going to suggest that. Good.
But I'm nervous about belonging to one because I don't want to engage in groupthink.
I hear you. Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Stay on the line, Philip. I'll post a few links that people can follow, certainly to the article that we mentioned, and maybe to your university website. Real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right.